have you now.
You're fulfilling your destiny.
Show me again the power of the darkness.
D20 Radio, where gamers roll. D20radio.com. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, to the Knights of Ren, episode 206. This week we have Rick and Jay. Welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Hey, what's up?
And we just want to say a big thank you getting this show started to our Patreons. We have just finished off for the first month of our Patreon subscriptions, memberships, gifts, whatever you want to call it. And so we are going to dedicate this show to our community with our Patreons, giving us a lot of questions and topics to build off of. And we're going to answer those questions and give our thoughts on what you guys wanted to know about. But before we do that, Jay has a shout out to a friend of his whose birthday it is and a tournament report to talk about. So let's hear what's going on, Jay.
Yeah, so I wasn't able to attend, but there was another event at Outflank up in Fairfield again here in California. And my buddy Matt Dokos, the guy who knocked me out of the last tournament at my other local the week before, he managed to take the whole thing. Him and Chud from our Discord have both been piloting Vader Raider, very strongly, and they are definitely two of the gatekeepers in our local meta. And I was really happy. Matt and I have practiced a lot, and he's practiced against some of our other play group, and it's really cool of him to have gotten that win. So I know he earned it. I know he's feeling good about it, and we still can't give him enough crap for it. So I said on his Facebook today, "Oh, did Chud go easy on you because it was your birthday?" Almost your birthday. Yeah, shout out to Matt. And also, I felt bad. I didn't actually announce who won the event prior. All I said was I didn't win, but shout out to Corwin, who won the event 2 weeks ago. He earned it with that Hanrei list, and yeah, so he definitely deserved, his name called. I love my local community. You guys rock, and I'll be bringing it this weekend. There's 2 events this weekend, so should have a pretty juicy report coming up later.
Awesome. Okay, the first question we've got that we're going to tackle comes from Gabriel Alonso, and he asked, if you had to build a gauntlet of top decks to test against, what would be in it? You don't want to duplicate types of decks that wouldn't have variants, for example, multiple different like Jango Veers builds or Vader Raider builds. So he's got a gauntlet with Jango Veers, Vader Raider, Vader Jabba, Han and Rey, Luke and Akbar, Rey double Padawan, Poe and double hired guns, Padme double Rebel Troopers, and then he's got either Bala Trooper Jango or Bala Trooper by 3. 3 troopers, 1 Bala. So he wants to know what would we add or remove from the deck, and then what are our thoughts on these decks and in relation to the current meta.
So yeah, I agree for the most part with his assessment of the gauntlet per se. I think you really want to try and squeeze in at least one Qui-Gon type deck in there, just so you can know that if you come up against a deck with a bunch of shields, that you can deal with it, and sort of like that. It's his list is pretty extensive, and that's a lot of decks that you want to play test about. You might even be able to kind of squeeze that down a little bit too.
Something to remember too is it's not just important whether or not you beat the deck, but how you beat the deck, why you beat the deck, and making sure that the person who you're testing with is piloting the deck correctly. Because it's easy to get into testing sessions and maybe you and your buddy play the same matchup 6 times and you won 5 times. But if you didn't really change your strategy much to accommodate for playing against that deck, maybe your deck's strong enough and is the counter and it works out naturally, but at the same time, you should really consider your mulligans. You should really consider your early plays. Should you lean towards more of your removals? Should you lean towards more of your upgrades? Are there certain upgrades and, certain cards that you don't favor? And then are there cards you don't play at all? And mark those down, keep those in mind. I mean, one of the things you'll notice as I've spouted out my deck lists, on our show, I change cards a lot. I test constantly. I try to get a feel for everything, every little neat little card. And even I fully admit that sometimes I just completely forget cards exist, because early when I played the game, I used to play way more expensive lists, and it was harder to squeeze in, cards like On the Hunt, where, like I said before, this card doesn't make money, so it's probably slowing me down. And honest to God, On the Hunt is in my top 10 easily now. So just pay close attention to what you are playing, what you aren't playing. If you ever draw 2 of a card and it's not, you're like, God, I never want to see 2 of this, maybe go down to 1 and slot in another situational card. I'm actually, case in point example, I'm really running into scenarios a lot with my current deck, the same Bala Jango Trooper list, where I don't want to see 2 Tactical Masteries, and I'm seeing it a lot, and I'm having a hard time even casting 1 lately, so I am strongly considering swapping out one of those slots. So always keep that kind of stuff in mind, what did I play, what didn't I, what worked, what didn't, why didn't it work, is it the fault of my deck, is it the fault of the matchup, and just pay close attention to exactly what you're up against. If you just look at as a win-loss, you may not have really learned anything.
Yeah, I definitely have to second what Jay said about when you're facing a gauntlet, there's a lot of things you have to consider. The first and foremost thing is, just because you beat player A playing Jango Veers doesn't mean you're necessarily going to beat player B playing Jango Veers, because first of all, the person may not know how to pilot the deck properly. Second of all, multiple people have different perspectives on how games are played, how cards are played, how they perceive interactions. So someone can take a Jango Veers deck with the exact same cards and play it in a very unique and different style that can throw you off. So just be aware, having access to specific decks doesn't mean you have hard quantifiable data that, my deck can 100% beat Jango Veers no matter what. That may or may not be true, and so you should always keep that in the back of your head, that just because you beat your friend playing Jango Veers doesn't mean you're going to beat everyone playing Jango Veers, and so on and so forth, because those interactions are always different based on cards you have in hand, cards they have in hand, experience between both players. What does the dice roll say? Did your friend get terrible rolls and then you go to a tournament and somebody gets god level rolls? I mean, lots of factors to comprehend and be aware of. In regards to the decks in the gauntlet, I'm definitely not seeing any Phasma. I would say at least have one variation of Phasma in there. She's viable. I know a lot of people aren't necessarily playing her. She's not in the super popular, hey, let's talk about this on all of the podcasts and so, but she's a very strong character, and you're going to have to deal with her somewhere. Also, like Rick said, Qui-Gon should definitely be in that list somewhere. He's got access to massive amounts of shields, and with the right configuration, and we're actually going to talk about a Qui-Gon deck later, another Patreon asked for that, he has ways to stall you to a really nasty point where it's just really difficult to kill him and what's on his field. So if you're not prepared for that, or you just don't have answers for it, it can make your life really tricky. I also don't see anything with Night Sister. She is extremely underrated, but that effect, being able to reroll dice for 1 damage, that can really mess things up, especially if you spent a lot of cards trying to get your dice fixed to a certain point. If they're running mill or anything like that, your opponent is out of cards, and or you're out of cards, and then somebody hits you with Night Sister. That's just really brutal. So I would at least practice against it and anticipate it, just because she is a very viable character in, I think, the upcoming meta. Here's a great question. What are some of the things, and I have an answer for this real fast. What are some of the things to look for in the midst of testing this gauntlet? What should you be attempting to achieve while you're testing in a gauntlet style setting?
Usually when I sit down with a gauntlet, I'm basically trying to get an understanding of how the games kind of play out. I mean, obviously, especially with Destiny, these games can be very different depending on a lot of different factors, but the games are going to play out reasonably the same. Roles will definitely change things up a lot, but the different archetypes of the decks are going to stay fairly consistent throughout your testing. So just seeing, when you need to be providing early pressure, when you need to be, holding back, or when the control versus aggro that I mentioned last episode, knowing when you need to push and when you need to kind of hold back for a little bit. And another thing with that, if you can't get these full decks together, if you don't want to proxy everything up, you need to at least take into account that with Destiny, you don't have you have the Trinity of gaming with the aggro, mid-range, and control archetypes, but aggro can be very different for you when playing against a ranged and a melee aggro list. So at the very least, you need to split those out, because you're going to need different cards to be able to fight those different matchups. So at the very least, you need to test against an aggro, one ranged version, one melee version, mid-range, and some version of control, whether that's like a mill deck, a Dooku, Kylo Ren type, grindy control, dice mitigation type deck, but whatever, right? You just need to find those three matchups and then splitting aggro with melee and ranged. And I think you'd be fine with that. Now, granted, the more testing you can do and the more experience you have with the deck is going to be your number one key. Just knowing your deck inside and out will get you further than knowing every single matchup.
The two most important things to remember when testing Destiny are, first off, make sure to test against your battlefield. Play against that Han Rey with the Junkyard, and assume the worst, that they're going to be recurring those second chances. Usually your battlefield, synergizes well with your deck. It should. See how your deck does in situations where, it's not running optimally. And to push the point further, something I try to do when I'm in really heavy test mode is I keep bad hands. Because you're going to draw bad hands in tournaments, and you're going to mulligan into worst ones. It's going to happen, just being honest, and you have to play through that. And it's better to just see the worst of your deck and not let it tilt you in an event, as opposed to only being used to, when the stars align and you draw exactly what you want. Because even in my recent testing and being in the TTS league and everything going on lately, my Bala deck won't give me upgrades in my opening hand. The past 4 hands I've had, plus Mulligan, I've had a Holdout Blaster. That's it. Which is fine, but I don't want to start with that. And that happens, and I have to play around that, and I have to, figure out what I'm going to do, and maybe I need to add more upgrades. I don't think I need to, statistically my odds are still pretty good with a full Mulligan that I'll find something, but stuff like this is going to happen. And if your deck consistently runs into this, you have to remember, is it the deck? Is it the matchup? So on and so forth. But also, I wanted to add on battlefield testing, also make sure that you do have the right battlefield. Specifically for a battlefield like Armory. Armory seems amazing, and in a lot of decks, it is. You can, just ramp, really cool upgrades out. You can get those 3 costs for 2 costs, which is just awesome. But if you're not claiming, or you're running into hands that you can't seem to claim it and, trigger it, maybe it's not the right battlefield. Even if half of your deck is upgrades, there might be something better.
One of the things I definitely utilize when I'm testing is, we're talking about a lot of mechanical things you can do in order to increase your, strategic knowledge, your experience. But I also like to talk about the psychology of the game. One of the big things for me is, especially in gauntlet testing and, just playing with friends, playing in environments where I have an advantage, I have a disadvantage, I have a good hand, a bad hand, whatever. You have to understand you can't beat every deck. There's no one deck that'll have the answer to everything. And so knowing that, you just have to look at the game as a puzzle. What can you do in the best way that you can do it? And sometimes you just can't win. There's not a no-win situation, but there's a lot of uphill battles you're going to have to face. And so understanding that you can get out of them with good plays and understanding the game, understanding the probability of what your dice can have, what your opponent's dice can have, that's extremely important. And that comes more from a mindset and an understanding of the game. And it's helped and bolstered through mechanical testing of, I've played 50 games with my deck versus persons who have said, I've played 5 games with the deck. Okay, you're more experienced, and going through gauntlets and testing is great, but you should also understand that sometimes someone might have a weird card in their deck that just specifically counters your play. And there's nothing you can do about it. It's in there specifically as a silver bullet to stop you. So if you can see things as a puzzle as opposed to it's, well, it's an uphill battle, I can't beat this aggro deck. No, that's not true. You can. Your opponent could, there's a lot of, your opponent could misplay, lots of variables. Your opponent could get a bad roll. Your opponent could have no cards in their hand that could help them. Lots of things you may or may not know about. And so you have to, learn and grow and perceive these things as you're playing the game. Look at your opponent's face. Are they fidgety? Are they kind of upset? Are they looking at their cards a lot? Are they playing with a certain card? Look at their resources. Do they have enough resources for a very specific, card that you suspect they could play? Just things like that. And it's really great because in all of this testing, you're going to be able to not only improve your deck, but you're going to learn so much more about the game by seeing all of these different types of decks in the gauntlet. And that's what's going to make you a better player, is seeing more interactions, seeing more things happening, seeing your deck fizzle, seeing your deck succeed, all kinds of stuff. So I think the gauntlet is a great idea. I would just add a couple variations. And like Rick said, you do have to consider that a control deck is control in multiple variations. You've got, melee control, you've got mill control, choke control, range control. So it's not just, I beat Vader Raider, I beat a control deck. You have to consider there's multiple flavors of these decks. And that's what makes Destiny fun for me, is that it's never just a single deck. There's always different flavors and different ways to play an aggro or a control or a mill deck. And I think that's phenomenal. So moving along, the next question comes from Steve Harvey, and he says, I personally would like to see some comparison of legendary decks versus non-legendary / budget decks. He's playing with the Django Bala Trooper non-legendary, and he's having a lot of fun, and just wants to know our thoughts on how the decks work. What do you guys think? Would you say one is necessarily stronger than the other? A lot of people have asked this question before. Do you feel like it's a pay-to-play kind of game?
So I think that the legendary cards, they're definitely legendary for a reason. They're some of the more powerful cards in the game, but if they're not right for the deck, then they're just not right for the deck. Like the Bala Django Trooper list, you could run thermal detonators in it, but that's not going to help you win with them. So there's no point to add them. There's not a lot of legendaries that I would say that you have to run these cards. I think the biggest one that I can think of is the one with the Force and Kylo Ren Saber. I don't think I'd run a blue melee deck without Kylo Ren Saber, and I don't think I would run a blue hero deck without at least one, most likely two, one with the Force. But when you go into the red and the yellow list, outside of characters, then there's not a whole lot of legendaries that I think are must run, and no matter what you're doing or in that deck build.
Yeah, legendaries definitely play their part in their game, but you have to remember that for every Force choke, there's a black one. For every Crime Lord, there's an ATST. So they're not the end-all, be-all, and there are plenty of decks that run, two or few legendaries. Most of the Qui-Gon lists are running around with one with the Force, and they prefer to have two Luke Sabers. One of the things I've learned recently that makes Qui-Gon really cool is in his hands, a Luke Saber is close to a Kylo Saber because the shield side and the ability to proc shields are more ways for him to deal damage. So it's not a Kylo Saber, but he gets more out of it, which is really neat. And even to a very small degree, the same thing for a regular lightsaber. I feel like there are a lot of lists that you can run that, don't necessarily require these cards. And again, my most fun deck for me is Bala. I just love all the yellow side damage. And I understand, I talk to a lot of people and they're like, I play Vader because I like to play Vader. And I hear you. Well, that's, a great reason to get into the game. It's a great reason to play that deck. And, it's frustrating when your favorite character is going to be the expensive one. I'm looking at set 2 and I'm just curious, how hard it's going to be for me to get Krennic, because I'm already just gobsmacked over Krennic. If he gets really good, he might be Vader set 2. Who knows? But just remember that whether you're collecting or whether you're deck building, it's easy to get drunk on the like what the power and potential of certain decks and cards are. Crime Lord looked super cool, and it's pretty fun to play, but it's honestly not the most exciting card to me. I've played it, and when you land that Crime Lord and you wipe that guy out, it's pretty cool, but there's also just to some degree, like, just what do you have fun doing? Right now, the most fun card for me, instead of Crime Lord, I'd rather Dirty Fight you and just see how many yellow dice I can throw into your face. Always remember to play what you enjoy, because I do very, very strongly feel that you'll do better with the decks that you actually enjoy playing, and actually you tend to consider more variables, you tend to get a better feel. And I'm not saying if your favorite deck is like a bottom tier rando list, like you'll climb to the top, but I still feel like if you actually enjoy the deck that you're playing, you'll do better than just trying to play a net deck of like, this is supposedly good, and if you're not having a fun time playing the game, then why bother?
Right. I do feel that the game does not force you to have legendaries to be a successful player. I've played lots of Yu-Gi-Oh!, Magic, and Pokemon. And Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh! Specifically, you have to invest a lot of money to get, in Magic you need when you've got these dual lands, very expensive creatures, planeswalkers, for example, or Yu-Gi-Oh! When you're building the deck with your extra monsters, you've got to spend, sometimes $30 or $40 for one card. But you've got multiple copies of that card you can potentially run. And so you can see some of these decks go into $5, $6, $7 or more $100. And if you want to play competitively, you have to pony that up. I don't think that's an issue whatsoever in Destiny. There's not a lot of legendaries I feel you must own to be competitive. The only deck that I feel that is, it's extremely legendary intensive, and that's Jabba Vader. You've got to have Jabba, you've got to have Vader, you need Force Chokes, you need Crime Lord. There's a lot of cards you need, and that can get somewhat expensive. But if you don't want to play that deck, you don't have to, and that deck doesn't win everything. It's strong, but it's not the 100% wins every game kind of deck. And that's what I like about Destiny, is there's a nice big zone of viable decks that can be legendary intensive, can have no legendaries, can have some legendaries. So I think it, like Jay said, it depends on what you want to play. If you're wanting to play Vader and Jabba, you're going to have to get your hands on quite a few legendaries to make that deck run. If you don't want to, you don't have to. And that's the beautiful thing, is there are very strong, potent decks that require little to no legendaries and few quote unquote expensive cards. So I think FFG has done a really strong job in balancing viable decks, because it's not for me, it's not pay to play. You don't have to have this multiple $100 deck just to compete. It's not necessary. And I think that's exciting for the community.
If you think back to that gauntlet that we were just talking about, just the sheer number of decks that we threw out there, that is the biggest gauntlet of any game that I've ever, said, you want to try against this, and this. And all of those decks are viable, and I think a good majority of those don't run an excessive amount of legendaries in them.
And that's another thing I definitely want to bring up. This is a base set. We don't have a single expansion, and there are easily, what would you guys say, 4 to 6 decks that can be played, and only 2 of them I can think of are expensive with, more than 4 legendaries in them. The rest are 2 or less. Maybe 3. Like, some hero decks run like double Luke Saber and a 1 with the Force, but that's about it.
Falcons and Hans and Poes, but again, that's if you're playing those, but Akbar fits that slot fairly well. People really like Poe, I get it, but yeah, there are a lot of decks to this game, and honestly, I feel like with how the expansion's gonna add more battlefields, more upgrades, more characters. Sure, I feel like some characters will probably be overshadowed and some characters will slot in better with others, but I have a strong feeling that like certain decks will probably stick around, or at least shells of the deck. Maybe they'll get a better support character. Who knows, maybe Vader Raider will become Vader something else. Maybe there's something that fills that hole. I really feel like a lot of the things that we're already used to, a lot of things that we already enjoy, are just going to be expanded on moving forward, which is really exciting. And what builds upon that is, while I'm sure more legendaries are going to drop and hit the fold, there's still going to be tons of like non-legendary cards that are going to be as exciting and as impactful in a lot of decks. I'm looking forward to the new stuff that isn't necessarily, purple or green at the bottom of these cards.
Yeah, and there's really very few just bad cards in this base set. Just to add on to that, there's like the one blue card that you can play a copy of another upgrade in your hand for free if you discard one. So what was that? Force is Strong.
Force is Strong.
Like,
is it though? Based on that card, is it?
Yeah, so like there's and on top of that, a good portion of your deck is built out of commons and uncommons. Like, I started building out that I wanted 15 dice producing cards in my deck, and I've started slowly going lower and lower and lower to, I think the lowest that I had was maybe 11. So that's a deck with 11 rares in it, and the rest is full of uncommons and commons. Now, granted, that was a Luke deck, but, still.
And the nice thing is, a lot of extremely powerful cards, believe it or not, come from the starter sets. You've got like Force Throw, the F11D rifle. There's a lot of strong cards that you can get just right out of the gate by buying a couple starter packs. And I think that's great because that's rare for a card game to have cards inside of a starter deck that you actually want to utilize. Usually they just throw in a bunch of fairly vanilla cards that you and your friends can play with at a fairly vanilla level. And then you start to switch out new options from booster packs. But Destiny has very strong options, like inside of both Kylo and Rey's starter decks. So I think legendaries are not must-haves. You can compete with or without them. That's my thought. All right, next question we have is someone asking, so this is Eric Seglum, and he asked if we can do another deck construction episode like we did with Vader Raider, where we build a deck, go over the options and why we pick this, why we don't pick that. So we'll definitely do that in a future show. But he has a second question. He was just basically asking, what is the process of playing and refining our decks? How many games do you play before you make changes? Do you make changes based on playing against one type of deck? Do you wait and make changes after playing a multitude of decks? Things like that.
So I'll jump on this one first. Basically, a lot of the times I play hyper casually and I try to just sit down with a bunch of different people and just get a feel, even against the same decks, but a different person piling it. And I just sit and see, like, again, what cards are in my hand? What cards did I use to reroll? Did I feel good about the reroll? Was it like, yeah, I'll pitch that. And then it's like, well, if I'm so comfortable pitching it, should it be in the deck? Or is it because I ran two of, expecting to draw one early and being okay with pitching it so that I can use another one later? Armed to the Teeth fills that for me. A couple people have told me they don't like the card. I still swear up and down by it, and I'm gonna keep running two because if I lose it to a random discard, which has been happening lately, I definitely want another one, and B, I just always want it in my hand for that kill shot. But for example, keep in mind what removal you're using versus what you're up against. And what I mean by that is, I've mentioned this in a previous show, but this is, I don't know, one of the most interesting discoveries I've made playing Destiny is the card Disarm. I still think Disarm is a very, very good card and will probably retain value between sets as far as like a good option, something to consider. I think it's really good in Hero right now. But what I noticed in my deck is a lot of times when I would disarm something, you're losing damage, which sucks. Like, you gotta keep that in mind. Like, that could have been 2 damage. If you use it on a naked modifier and you didn't have a way of getting it off anyway, then you didn't lose anything. But if you used, a standard side, and that cost you, that was damage, and that does add up. But more importantly, I realized I was disarming against decks that I wasn't afraid of, and I couldn't use Disarm in the matchups that were giving me trouble. Disarm doesn't really help me in my struggles against Vader Raider. I don't really care about disarming a Gaffy Stick, and it's a little too high to try and hit stuff like Kylo Saber for my list, so I ended up cutting it. So keep in mind that, like, you might feel like you have a really good card in your deck. I still think Disarm's a really good card, but it might not be doing what you need it to do to push your goals forward.
Yeah, one of the things that I do when I'm first building a deck is I'll use one of the deck builders, either the Star Wars Destiny DB or on the card game DB. And then I just want to look at, once I have it there and built, what the curve of the deck is. I like to see a spike 0 and 1. Like if I can get a spike at 0, that's great. And then slowly go down from there. Down to probably 3 is where I top at the most. And then after I make sure that my curve is looking where I want it to be, they have an option to be able to draw, opening hands on there. And I'll spend, a couple minutes just pulling hands and see if it's actually drawing things that I would want to see in the start of the game. And then maybe do a couple of what I would do in certain situations, pitching cards, thinking what my opponent may be playing, what cards I would play against it, that sort of thing, before I even sit down across from somebody playing it. And then after that, just like Jay was saying, just take note of what cards seem to be useful, which ones you're pitching for rerolls all the time, then make a decision if that's what you need in the deck or not. See what's giving you a problem, take a look back at the card list and see what can help out in those situations. Pretty much most of my decks right now are going to have at least one dodge in it just because of the meta. That's one of the things you're just going to pick up from playing it and whether it's actually going to be useful or not.
So when I'm testing my decks, I will build a deck from scratch. And traditionally, I will have anywhere between 4 to 8 more cards than what the deck can hold. And so what I like to do is I believe that when you're building a deck, you should trust your instinct. There's a reason you picked those cards in total. And then on top of that, there's a reason you picked 30 cards out of however many you initially chose. And so what I like to do is I'll set the cards that weren't used to the side and play a bunch of games, 5, 10 games with what deck I have versus whatever my friends are running. And so I like to get a nice spread of understanding. Like, I'm trying to gain understanding. I'm not trying to win games when I'm testing, because I feel that if I understand what the deck is and what it needs to do, I can win games. If I win games, I don't necessarily feel like I learned anything about the deck. And so for me, it's more about learning what are my weaknesses, what are my strengths, what are bad matchups, what are good matchups, when should I use my removal, when should I let my opponent resolve things. And so once I've kind of figured that out, like both Rick and Jay have said, then I start to think about what cards am I seeing that I'm not playing? What cards am I seeing that I'm eager to just pitch for either a reroll or, some kind of discard effect? What cards am I not functionally using? And then I have to ask myself, why am I not using them? And sometimes the answer is it was a bad choice, or they just don't fare well in an aggro matchup. Sometimes they're in the deck because of very specific, they're trying to be silver bullets, like that one dodge Rick was talking about. And so sometimes you have to consider, even though you might play a certain card very rarely, if that helps you get out of a certain situation that your deck just can't handle, it is something to consider that might be viable to stick in the deck and leave it there. The next thing I like to do is, once I've kind of played a lot, done a little bit of tweaking, I talk to the guys here, I talk to friends on Discord, Facebook, and I've got friends locally here that I'll play against, and I'll just sit and talk to them. And we'll discuss, what'd you think about the deck? Were you afraid of it? What did you think about this play? Was that something you were concerned about? Yeah, not really. I had some answers and, I would have shut it down. Or, yeah, that was really scary. We'll talk about things that could counter my deck, cards that can counter my plays, and then I'll talk about things that I have that can counter their deck. So it's just more about learning and gathering information for me so I can better understand what do I do in a specific situation with the tools that I have in my hand. And so that can definitely make decks become obsolete, because sometimes I'll throw together a deck and it's terrible and it doesn't work. There's no reason for it to exist. And so I'll try something else. And then sometimes you'll build a deck and then you'll find a shell for something you like. And so you'll swap out, like I'm working on a Qui-Gon deck and I've gone through probably 4 or 5 different iterations. Obviously Qui-Gon is the shell, But, I'll pull a card out, put a card in, move a character to, instead of 2 dice, 1 die, or I'll just take a character out and slot it in with something else and, make minor adjustments. But that's the whole point, is I'm trying to gather more information about what does my deck functionally do in the game state at a specific point, and try and make it function as efficiently and as dangerously as possible. Our last question comes from Andrew Heinz, and he says, "Hey guys, I would love to see an analysis of a Qui-Gon deck. I've been testing/running a Qui-Gon Akbar deck, and it's doing well. It's pretty reliable. And he would like to know both our take on him, and then, what would we slot Qui-Gon with when building that hero deck?"
So I've been playing a lot of Qui-Gon lately. I really like him, and I think he's one of the few really viable hero blue characters out there. Blue specifically, and heroes kind of in general, have a very big focus on shields and damage mitigation, as opposed to the dice control that a lot of the villain has. Kind of naturally figured, if I'm going to be using these shields, and sometimes I'll need them for damage or for prolonging the game, like against Jango Veers, but if I don't need them, then I want them to be able to do something, and that's where Qui-Gon kind of comes in for you. Being able to change being able to use those shields for damage when you don't need them to stay alive is just a really good ability to have tacked on to a pretty decent dice. One of the things you kind of got to keep in mind, though, is that you don't want to just overload the deck with shields, because you need to be able to do other things than just create a lot of shields. And one of the problems with the deck, especially with villains, is that they have a lot of ways of getting rid of not just one shield, but getting rid of all shields on a character. So you got, On the Hunt, you got the blue Intimidate, which is, 0 cost, just get rid of all the shields. And then to a lesser extent, you got the TIE Fighter that has the special to be able to get rid of shields. And on top of that, you got Kylo Saber that allows you to re-roll the dice if you hit a character with the shields on that special side. One of the traps of the deck is that you end up throwing a lot of shields into the deck and not a lot of everything else that you need to win. You kind of want to limit it. And I saw a thing on Facebook today asking, in a Qui-Gon deck, are you going to use Take Cover or Defensive Stance if you had to pick one of them? And I think that's a very good thing to look at there, that, you don't necessarily need both of them in the deck, and you probably it's probably actively bad to run both of them in the deck. So what do you guys think about? I mean, that's the first step there. Do you want to run either that, or do you want to run Defensive Stance, or do you want to run Take Cover in that?
I personally choose Defensive Stance over Take Cover. 2 shields is a lot. There's a lot of reasons why, but for me, the 2 shields that's a lot of damage mitigation, and especially with Qui-Gon, usually 1 shield for 1 damage isn't that great, but being able to turn 2 shields into 1 damage and 1 shield on Qui-Gon, I like that a lot better. It's true, it does cost 1 resource, but I feel like you get way more bang for your buck with Defensive Stance than you do with Take Cover, especially since your card slots, like you said, Rick, it is a problem with the deck. Like, every single slot in that deck has to be doing something to win the game, and it's tough because there's a lot of good options, but you have to make sure that Qui-Gon decks need to be really focused on doing something. And I've seen a lot of players try and make Qui-Gon decks do like 2 or 3 things. Like, you're trying to have shields, and you're trying to make money, and you're trying to deal damage, and usually only one of those things is kind of happening, and the other 2 aren't doing much. And so you generally have a lot of uphill battles against decks because you're not doing a lot of things well, and you're just kind of spreading yourself out way too thin. So I think a really focused card helps, and I feel that Defensive Stance is more focused, and you get more out of it than you would. I know it is free. You're spending a card to get a shield. I just think those 2 shields are way more impactful.
So I'm actually going to bring up some defending points for Take Cover. While I do feel that, honestly, the choice is between what feels more natural to you and what card you prefer, I do think that in some regards, Take Cover is the better option. I do think that it being free is very, very relevant in a deck that, Hero doesn't have as many great ways to cheapen things. They have It Binds All Things, which is definitely a card you're going to use with Qui-Gon, but beyond that, resources can be fairly scarce, and you need to be using your dice to do the damage a little more reliably, I feel, on Hero in most cases. Especially with Qui-Gon. So being able to just round out any moment that you have shield with a ping, it's literally free damage. I wouldn't use the card to get the shield. I mean, it depends, if did your opponent claim and you have a bunch of free actions, that's different. But I think you will run into situations with defensive stance where it's possible that card will be stuck in your hand because you'll be playing either other actual like defensive options or trying to play upgrades or whatever, where I feel like you can sneak in moments for take cover to, if your goal for shields is to deal damage, you want take cover. If your goal for shields is to actually keep yourself alive, and there's definitely both ways to make a Qui-Gon deck, and decks in general with those in mind, that is more the deciding factor to remember. So I personally would probably take cover just because it smooths your curve, doesn't stick in your hand, which is one thing that I'm learning to pay a lot of attention to now, is like I try to make sure I draw at least 2 cards around and make sure that I did to the cards that I want later, instead of running into situations where if I'm holding like 4 cards, sometimes I don't draw what I need. And if I'm not playing those 4 cards in my next turn, like, why are they still there? Like, even if they're really good removal, if I'm not digging, if I'm not like improving my board state, something's wrong. So keep that in mind. Again, I still think Defensive Stance is a good card, and there are Qui-Gon decks that run it, love it, and it's exactly what you want, and you can curve out and it not slowing you down. But there are some variations where you want to use those resources elsewhere, so keep that in mind.
Yeah, that 0 cost of take cover just can't be understated. I mean, I lean towards more take cover, just being able to play it out of hand, not have to have the resource, not be stuck in a situation where you got to choose between playing your dice removal or playing an upgrade or then playing defensive stance. It's worth a lot to me. There's a lot of situations where you'll be stuck on 3 shields with Qui-Gon, and then that extra shield off of defensive stance is wasted in that situation.
That's fair. Something I want to query your brains on. I've played a couple variations. What characters do you think pair well with Qui-Gon? And what characters do you think do not pair well with Qui-Gon?
I think the obvious choice is Rey. And then after that, I think the other choice here is whether to do Elite Qui-Gon, Elite Rey, or what I've been playing a lot is single dice on Qui-Gon and Rey, and then adding a Padawan. Because Padawan, I think, is one of the more underrated characters in the game. Her die is probably one of the best for the cost that you're paying for it. And then tack on the ability to play weapons on her for 1 cheaper. So allowing you to play lightsabers first turn, Luke's lightsaber first turn, and then overriding those into other more expensive upgrades, like one with the Force or Force Throw is just exactly what Qui-Gon needs, because the blue hero upgrades are way too expensive, to the point that I stopped even running Force Protection with Qui-Gon. And it sounds crazy, but there's just so many times where I don't have those 3 resources that I want to spend for something that is going to give me shields some of the time. And then the other option, I think the only real other option would be Finn there. And I really loved Finn way back in the dark days of just playing on Tabletop Simulator without the full card list. But his dice really pair well with Qui-Gon, to where I think I would run 2 Finn before 2 dice on Finn instead of Elite Qui-Gon.
I think this Akbar experiment is really interesting because you get double Qui-Gon, double Akbar. So it's similar-ish to, the common loot bar. And again, like, Qui-Gon gets slightly more out of a loot saber, which is really, really interesting to me. Can synergize better with, like, the shield flood that you get You get 2 Akbar dice, so it's double the chances for the double focus, which cannot be understated. So I kind of hope people try this more. I'm really intrigued by it, because one thing I really notice a lot is, like, I just really hate it when I'm playing a 3-die deck when I feel like, I wish there was a 4-die version. And I'm not saying this will have the same amount of success as Loot Bar. I mean, Loot definitely hits for 3. Loot draws cards. Loot has more health. I mean, all these things matter dramatically. Give it a shot. I'm going to. I'll say it right now. And the more I see Qui-Gon, the more I'm impressed by him. And he's also probably someone to pay very close attention to in set 2. I mean, that's just my guess. But this whole base set, he's felt like he's had like 80% of the support that some other characters have had more of, and he's always just been like clawing to get into the top. And I think there are some good Qui-Gon Rey decks that can do fairly well as a whole. Like, I feel like Qui-Gon is just at the perfect price point where he could just get a new partner and go to town.
I think the one thing with Akbar there, I think you take a little too much of a hit in your damage output with him. For one, you're mixing your damage faces, so it's going to slow you down a little bit on those rare occasions when you actually get damage out of Akbar. But you do gain, like Dug In and Field Medic from Akbar. But I don't know if the hit on the damage output is too much instead of, say, Rey or something else. Because, I mean, when I played Luke Akbar was really just a leadership output for Luke. And then once Luke dies, then Akbar just kind of sits there and hopes that he can deal enough damage to kind of draw the game out, and you're probably just going to lose at that point anyway.
I'm trying something kind of weird. I'm doing 1 Qui-Gon, 1 Rey, and 1 hired gun, because I want access to yellow, control, and smuggling. Because, like we've said, the deck is really tight on resources, and I feel that the double side resources off of hired gun, and to the lesser extent, Rey has 1 resource and a +1 modified. Those two in conjunction can help make enough money with access to smuggling that you can get out quite a few cards reliably. Like, you can hard cast these things, and you get access to negotiation, you get access to electroshock, you get access to yellow removal that can help keep you alive significantly longer. And I mean, so far it's working well. It does have problems with damage, but on the occasion where you roll out that 3 damage for 1 resource, you get an equipment on Rey, and you use Qui-Gon to help put shields on people. Like, it's a tough deck to kill because there's a lot of health. You've got 9 on hired gun, 10 on Rey, and your opponent isn't really sure who to kill because they each only have 1 die, so none of them are specifically more powerful than the other right off the bat. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
I think when you dilute the damage type, going away from strictly melee, Rey's die at that point becomes pretty bad. And what you're gaining out of there is a dice that has a die that has a better chance of doing resources or rolling resources, but it also is going to then cost you more resources in the end too. And with mono blue, and especially if you're running Padawans, it really helps with the resource choke that you get out of those expensive resource or upgrades and cards from blue, especially hero blue. And also Padawan's die is really good for making Rey's die actually do things when you don't have like Awakening out or something like that. Now I can see where you're going at there, and especially the fact that you get 30 health out of that pair, or out of that trifecta, but sacrificing 2 health for the Padawan and sticking straight to blue is where I lean towards, but you lose out on Electroshock and Negotiate. So you're kind of like, where do you want to go with the deck there? You want to be a little bit more aggressive? Do you want to be a little bit more control? And that deck can go very slow. So I tend to lean a little bit more on the aggressive side when I play Qui-Gon, because I know that if I go too defensive, it's just going to stall out too long, and I haven't done enough damage to get the game.
That's fair. I will say Qui-Gon testing, I've had a lot of trouble with mill decks because I'll have so many shields. Great. But you get hit with the right mill and you lose all of your lightsabers. If you lose all your equipment, it's really hard to win a game because you can't deal damage fast enough to win. So that's just a personal experience I've seen in testing.
And yeah, and if you want yellow, I think the better choice really is Finn there, because he gives you a melee side for one, and he has a shield on his native to his dice, so it goes a little bit more into your strategy than the hired gun does.
Okay, that's fair. All right, next question. We're moving to our Facebook page where we actually had a couple of really good questions I want us to talk about. So the first one comes from Billy Felon, and he asks, what do we think is the most underrated card in Awakenings?
I think I still go back to Padawan on that. I mean, I got a lot of choices on there, but I really think the Padawan is the most underrated. I've seen character tier lists where they don't even Padawan doesn't even hit the playable side of the tier. And if you just look at that dice or that die, and you look at the number of melee or number of damage sides, the focus side, and then tack on the ability, and I just think it's a really good character for the cost. The problem is it's in a relatively weak faction side. Blue not having a whole lot of Hero Blue not having a whole lot of access to dice removal. Now, granted, they have one of the best in Force Misdirection, but you need to have a lot of setup to make that really good, especially on the range side, which is why a lot of the blue upgrades have that one random range side on it that nobody knows how it got on there. But it's really tough in the current meta that's kind of driven by ranged aggro decks of being able to really fend off the attack on there without getting really lucky on your rolls. So that's why I think that Padawan is my least or most undervalued card in the set.
I have a few choices. If I had to pick a character, a lot of these choices I feel like stronger, more experienced players will probably go like, why would you name that? Like, obviously this is good, but I think like newer players probably would look past some of these picks, so I'm going to bring them up. First off is Kylo. Kylo can seem really frustrating. He has a pay side. He has a very situational special side that can be feast or famine. But, man, for his cost, like, he has 11 health. That's honestly a lot of health in this game. He does have 3 damage sides. If you build him right, if you give him the right stuff, he's a great holocron target, so you can save that money and get to do powerful effects with him. I really like how cheap he is. I think, with time, like, better options will be attached to him, and I do think that he's fairly solid. I still test with him a lot. I still have a lot of fun with him. And there's times, you're going to play against those like luxury decks with the heavy costers, and they sweat your special. They discard aggressively to avoid your special, and that's something that's like super game changing. Another card, I kind of mentioned it earlier. Again, good players will probably be like, yeah, this card's great, but it took me a while to kind of see it for what it really was, and that's On the Hunt. On the Hunt is a fantastic cheap upgrade. It's a cheap die. It has 2 special sides, and its special side completely just drains all shields on a target, which is a lot. It's a lot of effective damage. And then for paying 1, you basically get like a free die removal. The only thing it doesn't hit or supports. You hit the character that you want, and you take the character die or the upgrade die off, and you're paying 1, and at first that seemed expensive, but that's a flank or an electroshock. And a lot of times it's a 2-for-1. I find that die to be just very satisfying to use all the time, and sometimes it gives you more damage. So it's there where you need it. It can cause your opponent to pause. They'll roll in, and then you'll just hit them and effectively 1-cost removal, whatever their best roll was, and it doesn't cost you a card. So On the Hunt is, like I said, like that card is like skyrocketed into one of my favorite cards in the set. And then lastly, a card I'm going to be playing a lot more with. I really want to give melee more attention. I've been kind of lost in like the range sphere, but Close Quarters, is it Assault? Yeah, Close Quarters Assault. This card, if you roll out well enough, you can wipe out like 4 cards like easily, like Qui-Gon Ray or lists like Kylo Dooku. If you hit 3 or 4 cards with that, like you've probably screwed their turn. I mean, that's what it's done when it's hit me. If you've noticed that your opponent in the last round like had 3 cards in their hand before the next round started and they didn't discard anything, they probably have stuff they want to keep or plan on using against you. You know, they might be like slow rolling their, you know, backup muscles or good removal, or, you know, their powerful blue abilities waiting for their holocron proc, and you can just smoke someone out of a turn, and it doesn't cost you anything. This card's free. It's crazy. I have so much respect for Close Quarters Assault now, and I'm strongly considering playing more around and with it, and just like how absolutely devastating it is to hit for 3 or 4. It's disgusting. I really enjoy that card.
Cool. My personal choice for this is definitely Cannon Fodder. After we had a long discussion about moving it into your Bala deck, I have completely underestimated the power of that card. The biggest thing for me is Cannon Fodder it's basically Guardian on a stick. So you pay 0, you allocate damage from a damage showing die to a non-unique character. And that's just, it's so amazing because a lot of people don't necessarily know about it, and a lot of people really don't respect that card because nobody plays it yet. And so it's easy to turn 1, drop, say, an F11D rifle on a character, and then roll out your dice, and you're great to go. And then people are sitting there going, okay, cool, this guy has obviously no dice removal, so I can do whatever I want. And so what they'll do is they'll roll out their dice, they'll re-roll their dice, they'll use mitigation and get something to, you know, a nice healthy 2 base damage, and then they'll flip all their other dice to modified sides. And then you play Cannon Fodder, you eat that base damage, and your opponent is either out of cards or they're sitting on a bunch of modified dice that they just can't use. And now they have to get rid of that one card they've been trying to save in order to re-roll their dice, or they just quit and they take the battlefield, and that's it. So it's a really, really powerful card. I think it's got a lot of potential that players are going to be utilizing in tournaments. I think you definitely, if someone has red and a non-unique character, you know, Stormtrooper, obviously, you got to be aware that card should definitely be in that deck, because shutting someone out turn 1 or turn 2 with that card it's a lot of pain. It's very, very devastating when played at the right moment. And I think that card is phenomenal. All right, we have one last question we definitely want to tackle. This comes from Alexander Hold Markland, and he says, with the most popular decks in the meta changing every week, do you believe that we should reassess card prices? For example, hero decks such as Qui-Gon and Rey, Hyperloop, things like that are rising, but their value is still much lower than decks such as Vader Raider. What are your guys' thoughts on this?
So I think that the card prices are mostly dictated by about what the major retailers or third-party sellers are putting them at. And the hero decks that he was talking about didn't pop up until the last big shipment kind of sold out on the singles market. So at that time, a lot of people were going after, you know, the villain decks more aggressively, especially like cards like Vaders and Crime Lords and Jabbas and things like that. So then they obviously sell out all those cards, so those prices, you know, will creep up, and then they kind of stay at where they sold out at. So those card prices aren't going to change when they're not selling the cards, because they don't want to, you know, dictate the price on that card if they don't have any in stock. So right now, when a lot of the singles market is kind of dried up from lack of having extras to sell, those cards are not going to change in price. So where you need to look now is more on the eBay side of people that are selling their, individuals that are selling a lot of cards and what they're selling at. And I'd be willing to bet that if you look at it now, they have taken that change in what the meta is doing, right? So if the hero decks are being more shown, then they're going to sell more, and that's where you're going to see the change in the prices.
I agree with Rick. There are a lot of factors to consider when playing the secondary market game. I've done a lot of Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh sales. So I think there's a couple factors you have to consider with prices. First of all, one of the biggest ones, honestly, right now is there is a product shortage. There's more people who want the product than product that exists. So immediately prices are going to be higher than normal because, for example, I have product, someone else doesn't. So I can charge a higher price point for this thing that I have. And so you've got prices that are, automatically higher than regular. On top of that, people are going to tend to gravitate towards cards and decks that are popular or cards and decks that are winning tournaments because people want to win tournaments, and that's fair. So when you're talking about, should we reassess cards based on popularity? That's how secondary markets work. You can see a swing from one week to another week. If someone comes out with some hero deck that, say, Han and Leia or Padawan and Rebel Trooper or something like that, you'll see a spike in the price of those cards because those have been determined as successful, game-changing elements. At this point, it's just really difficult to make an assessment because the game is really young. I understand Fantasy Flight is trying to print out as much as they can and get their product into the hands of people, but even still, if everyone had all the cards they want, there would still be fluctuation in prices based on popularity because, if Vader Raider is popular and everybody wants it, well, then people who don't have it are going to want to pay for it, and people who do have it are going to try and charge an extra premium to sell off their extras. So I don't think it's necessarily about reassessment of card prices. I think it's just following the market. And that's what secondary markets do. They dip, they fall, they go up and they go down because things are constantly changing. And the decks we're talking about now will be totally different in a month, and then a month after that, and so on and so forth. So similar to the stock market, you kind of have to understand that, a card's value is going to go up and a card's value is going to go down. If you're trying to buy, obviously you want to buy it at a low point. And obviously Vader is going to be popular for a long time. Jabba the Hutt is going to be popular. Luke Skywalker, Han Solo. Those cards are probably not going to dip low. You might see a dip in, say, $3 to $5, but they're going to be fairly high because they're just popular characters in the Star Wars universe. And they're legendary, so they're harder to find than any other kind of card. And their effects are extremely strong. So I would say maybe it's not reassessment, but just watching the card, and if you can get a great deal on it in purchasing or in trade, get it. Because, I doubt you're going to get a much better deal than, $10 off any specific very popular legendary card. It's just something to consider and watch for. Some cards, say like a Datapad, Jetpack, Holdout Blaster, those will definitely fluctuate based on the meta. Right now, range damage is really popular, very successful, hard-hitting, and winning tournaments. So cards that help accelerate that, such as, Holdout Blaster, those cards are going to be popular. If we ever get into a meta where we see melee damage become more popular, those cards will probably dip in price, and it's a great time to pick them up once the price point has lowered itself due to, supply and demand and popularity. So I think once we get set 2, once the meta fleshes out, once things become more fluid and we see, hey, there's a lot more options, a lot more decks, I think the card prices are going to come down quite a bit. And you're going to see fluctuation in a couple dollars as opposed to $5, $7, $10 because, Jango Veers, that's the thing to play. Holdout Blaster jumps in price. Jetpack jumps in price. Datapad way up. Once those decks are no longer the ultimate, quote unquote, ultimate deck, I think those things will kind of come down to more appealing price points. One last point I have to say about card prices, secondary market, all that stuff. I can definitely say without a shadow of a doubt in my heart, and this is a personal opinion, but get the cards you want to play with. If there's a card that you see and that's at a price that you're comfortable with, pick it up. If you're not comfortable with it, don't buy it. There's nothing wrong with waiting. There's nothing wrong with playing another deck. Like we said with multiple shows, there are tons of viable options that won't cost you an arm and a leg. But if you see a Vader and it's a number you're okay with, go for it. Play Vader. Have fun. That's the whole point of Destiny and just gaming in general. Enjoy the game. Play the game. Make friends. Have stories to tell. Meet new people. Go to events. Make friends. Win stuff. Take pictures. Smile. Just enjoy yourself. I mean, there's nothing wrong with paying a price that you're comfortable with. And that's really all I have to say about the secondary market is, like any card game in the world, cards are going to go up. Cards are going to go down. They're going to fluctuate, and we don't really know where they're going to fluctuate to or when they're going to fluctuate. But if you see a card at a number you like, go for it. Just have fun. And that's the best advice I can give to new players, old players, anyone listening to this. Just have fun and enjoy the game. So the next question we have comes from Tom Damon, and he asks, what is the best Hero Mill shell? And I have a really quick answer for you. We wrote a huge post on Facebook going over Hero Mill, the shell, what to expect from it, what it doesn't do really well with, what it does do really well with, certain cards that you can utilize to make that deck function really strong. So I would recommend, instead of us going over that, check out our Facebook page, and I think all the answers you're looking for are there. So the last question we have for this episode comes from Chris. I'm going to try and pronounce your last name, Niederhauser Jr., and he asks, how do you rate or rank Captain Phasma, and why? I love the card, and I keep hearing she is better than was thought, but I can't find any more information. So, Jay, I believe you are one of the more knowledgeable Captain Phasma players.
Yeah, I have played a lot of extensive Phasma, and I think a lot of the issues that I've run into with playing her and her feeling not right is that I've been trying to play her in the wrong deck. She has a lot of strong options and ways to be built, and when I was doing my heavy Bala testing, I was trying to make a Bala deck and sort of like fit her in the Django slot without realizing and trying to do Bala Django tricks. But I do feel like there are lists that celebrate her a lot better. You obviously need to push red harder and sort of get the most out of her. She does well both in lists that use her in one die, and I honestly think there is a very competent two die list for her. One that players like to bring up is obviously the Trooper E-Phasma one die Bala, and this gives you, of course, the access to all the strong yellow cards that you like. But when she is commanding 2 dice, she is very, very capable of running Commanding Presence, a card that I think is fairly strong, and if used correctly can generate you a lot of damage and a lot of money. One of the best things about it is the earlier you can get it out, you can use that on a resource side, and getting 3 money off of 1 die, well 2 technically, is still very, very powerful and can improve your engine, allow you to play more upgrades or even more defensive cards, pump out things like TIE Fighters. I meant to add earlier in the underrated cards, he's in a really funny spot, but I feel like as the meta gets stronger and supports get a little more support, because right now they're a little slow, but I feel like supports are a direction that the game will probably lead to. I think TIE Fighter is actually going to become a little more well-known, because it's kind of just like one degree off of a character for 3, and in some games where my opponent have been able to get it out early and aren't as focused on controlling the battlefield, it's very frustrating to play against a TIE Fighter because it just honestly feels like another Stormtrooper. And so I feel like if there were better ways to generate money, we would see more cards like it on the field. And right now, yeah, the tempo is like leaning towards aggro, and it's tough. And I think one of the reasons why I fell out of favor with Phasma is she's a little slower, and sometimes that slowness trips me up. I'm actually right now brewing a deck for Elite Phasma with the sole purpose of trying to celebrate her as much as possible, because I do think she's strong. I do think Guardian's relevant. I do think if you can generate enough money, running an endless ranks is very viable with her, chumping out more stormtroopers, getting one, maybe even two TIE fighters out, and just trying to play the slow, calculated red deck with enough yellow support to, get those backup muscles and that incredibly strong removal going, and just like make a deck that totally shines on her, because she has very consistent damage. You cannot underestimate her discard side, especially again with commanding presence. She has focus. Focus gives you the money, gives you the damage, gives you whatever it is you're looking for. Focuses that commanding presence to whatever you need on that. It's just she's really great. She's really well costed, and she's always going to be something to look out for as we get more non-unique characters. She's good now. I think she's a little slow, so you just have to learn to play that way. But if you do it well, I'm hopefully going to have a new deck for you guys soon to talk about. So look forward to it.
I mean, Jay nailed it. I think she's primed if they get a lot of red support. Her and two stormtroopers have a really good control game. The Guardian ability on two characters with her, in addition to the best defense and cards like that, can really make the damage get spread out among multiple characters and make it really difficult for your opponent to focus one down. And it makes these games go way into the late game that you don't normally see in a lot of these games right now. So if she gets a little bit more support in red with the next sets coming out, she will be a very viable control list.
Yeah, I agree with everything that was said. My 2 cents are, I'm not right now a big fan of like tiers or ratings. For me, I just look at cards. Are they playable? Are they unplayable? And then in what capacity? I don't think that she is a bad tier. I don't think she's an unplayable tier. I think she's great. I think she has a very specific slot right now. I definitely think she is going to get better as the game progresses, as we see more non-unique characters come out, because it affects any non-unique that you get. So if we get some great blue non-uniques, yellow non-uniques, other red non-uniques, she's viable with those. And I think she's fine. She may not be as fast or as flashy or as quote unquote, cheap with, holocrons and whatnot, but I don't think that matters. I think she's totally viable, and she can definitely win games against any deck that's out there. You have to know how to build it. You have to know how to play it. That's pretty much it. So yes, I think if you've got a Phasma, get her on the table, put her together with some stuff, and have some fun with her. That's what I feel about Phasma. I've got her in testing, and I'm enjoying playing her with troopers quite a bit.
She's really fun with Night Sister too. The double Phasma Stormtrooper Night Sister list is pretty good. It's a little weird, but you do get the double Guardian. You can play some of the good blue interactive cards. You can even try and go for crazy stuff like Holocron if you want to. I've seen that list. It's fun. I can't tell you it's reliable, but Phasma has a lot of health. If you use your cards and your defensive options wisely, you can make Phasma a house, and she can get really scary really fast.
She's another character that doesn't matter if you're bringing her elite or not. She still gets full benefit of her ability. So can't underestimate that.
Right, and she's got access to some of the better cards in the game. F11D rifle. You've got your DH-17 crappy blaster, quote unquote. You've got access to the best defense. If you bring Night Sister, you've got blue removal. If you bring yellow, you've got access to He Doesn't Like You. You've got access to Electroshock. She does what she needs to do, and she does it well. So if you want to play Phasma, by all means, build a Phasma deck, play it out, have fun. She's good.
Real quick, on the Night Sister note, a fun deck with her is to make her with the Night Sister and use Power of the Dark Side, because you have the Stormtrooper die. You can put in stuff like Datapad, and you have in the DH-17 blaster, and you can get a ton of those missides and it can work to your favor. You can get the best out of, using those rerolls and sneaking that damage in. And if you play cheaply and you keep your costs down, it can work really well. I've seen Power of the Dark Side. It's expensive, but if your deck is really built around it and still does all the normal things you want a deck to do, it can do really great. It's a very fun deck.
We here at the Knights of Ren are super proud to announce that we are a sponsor of the Steel Open 2017 happening April 7th through 9 in Herndon, Virginia. You can find out more information at steelopen.com, where you can find out the events for not only Destiny, but X-Wing, Armada, and so much more. And you can also register yourself for this 3-day super amazing private event. Definitely check this out if you're interested in Destiny or any kind of Star Wars tabletop events. This is the premier place to check out games and get ready for Worlds, because this is happening 1 month before Worlds. You don't want to miss out. SteelOpen.com. So that's the end of our show. Thank you everyone for listening this week. We want to do a big shout out to our First Order Majors. These are our highest level Patreons. So thank you so much to Eric Segum, Drew Ibernardo, Gabriel Alonso, Christopher Bates, Anthony Carzales, and Stephen Frantic. If I mispronounced your name, I'm really sorry. But thank you so much, guys, for your contributions to the show. And we're going to start shouting out the names of all of our Patreons as we keep going through. So we are so thankful. We can't do this without you, and we really appreciate your support. So thank you very much, Jay, Rick. Do you guys have any last thoughts before we wrap the show up?
Just to follow what Suji's saying, thank you so much to our patrons and to those who support us on Facebook and Discord. Everyone helps, sharing our articles, giving us likes, and giving us your feedback. And, it's all because of you guys that we're doing this, and we're having a lot of fun, and we hope to have many more, Patreon-inspired shows.
Yes, thank you guys and gals so very much. We really appreciate it. So that being said, that is the end of this week's show. So thank you everyone for joining us, and may the Force be with you.